Welcome to Taproot Foundation's webinar, Create Your Nonprofit Strategic Plan with Volunteer Support. It's great to have you all here. Today's webinar is all about big, audacious thinking and smart goal setting. So a strategic plan really serves as a roadmap for your organization to define goals in order to achieve your mission. It also plots the course for how you're going to reach those goals over the next 2 to 5 years. And so during the planning process, board and staff members collaborate with other key stakeholders to determine how you're going to design programs, allocate resources, and measure success. So there's a lot there. So without further ado, I want to get into today's presentation because we've got a lot of really great content to cover. So quick introduction to our speakers today. And as we introduce ourselves, we'd love for you to continue introducing yourself in the chat box. So thank you to everyone who's already taken a moment to introduce yourself. Please let us know the organization you're joining us from and one of your professional super strengths. My name is Kimberly Swartz. Pronouns are she, her, hers. I am based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, but recently moved here from Brooklyn, New York. And I'm Taproot Foundation's Director of Community Engagement. And my professional super strength is empathy. So I'm joined by my colleague, Joshua Grohl. Josh, would you mind jumping in and introducing yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Josh. I'm the nonprofit success coach here at the Taproot Foundation. I am also in North Carolina, just about 2 hours away from Kim, or where Kim lives in Raleigh. And I'm a he, him. I'm excited to talk to everyone today about strategic planning. My professional super strength is communication.
Thanks, Josh. So as we mentioned, we are both joining you from Taproot Foundation. And if you're unfamiliar with Taproot Foundation, we have colleagues who are managing the chat box who would be more than happy to provide more information on what our nonprofit does. And we're also more than happy to answer more questions on that specifically during the Q&A time that we've reserved at the end of this presentation. But in short, Taproot Foundation is a nonprofit that supports other nonprofits. We are here to get you the business support that you need to really thrive. And we do that by connecting nonprofits, social good organizations, public schools, fiscally sponsored organizations together with skilled volunteers from the corporate world and the private sector. So a few logistical notes before we dive into the heart of our presentation. Like I mentioned, we're joined by a Taproot colleague, Samina Usmani, who's managing the chat box today. So all attendees will be muted throughout today's webinar, but we encourage you to please ask questions and leave ideas or comments in that chat box. Samina will be answering questions throughout, or will flag to Josh and I for a question and answer section at the end of our event. So with those notes out of the way, I actually have a question for the group that I'm going to pose as a poll. So you should see a quick question appearing on your screen right now that I would love for your thoughts on. So what experience do you have with nonprofit strategic planning? Are you a newcomer? Are you in the middle of a planning process? Are you really experienced with the process and are here because you're curious about how volunteers can support the process? Your responses will really help us tailor some of the recommendations and ideas we share throughout the event. All right, I'll give folks a couple more seconds to respond. You see, Valerie, newcomers are very welcome, so you're in a good space. Thanks, everyone. We'll do 10 more seconds, and then we'll publish the results for folks. It looks like we've got a good mix in the room. Yep, I see Tyler's chiming in. We've got some other newbies chiming in the chat. Thanks so much. All right, sharing the results with you so you can see you're in good company. We've got a really good mix here of folks who are new to the process, maybe right in the thick of it, right in the middle of it. We're all sending you a lot of strength right now. We know it's a big project to tackle. And we've got some folks on the line who are really experienced and maybe are looking for new resources, new ways to fuel that process that they're already experienced at. So that's great. All right, switching us back to the deck. Now that we've gotten to know the folks in the room a little bit more, I'm so pleased to pass the mic over to Joshua to share an overview of the strategic planning process. So Josh, why don't you take us away?
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Kim. I'm really excited to talk strategic planning with everyone today and give you all kind of a crash course because I'm a former strat plan skeptic. So one of those people, I'm a doer, like I just want to do the work. And it's a lot like when, your teacher tells you, well, you need to have an outline first. And I'm like, well, I just want to go ahead and start writing. And then halfway through, I'm like, oh yeah, I probably should have some kind of outline. So I'm hoping to make some new converts to strategic planning. And for the people who are kind of just now starting strategic planning, I hope to be able to just share some basic information with you that'll help organize your own process at your nonprofits. So to start off with, a kind of basic question here is, what is a strategic plan? So starting from square one, a strategic plan is basically your organization's North Star, the thing that kind of marks the path that you're working towards. It's also a management tool that helps all levels of your organization, from the volunteer on the ground doing operations assistance to your board and your CEO or your executive director, work together to achieve whatever it is your mission might be. A strategic plan is generally systematic and structured and very data driven. And ultimately, it's a blueprint for the acquisition and allocation of resources. So it also helps you plan how you're going to direct the resources, how you're going to direct your revenue. It helps also show external stakeholders how you're directing your resources and how you're directing your revenue. One of the big upsides for strategic planning, other than having a path to follow, which every organization really needs to have, is that as many of you have probably found out, when you're applying for grants, when you're pitching donors, when you're trying to make partnerships, oftentimes they want to see some kind of strategic plan. It's kind of like, asking creditors for a big loan to start a new business. They're going to want to usually see what your business plan is. So if for no other reason, this is a really important reason to do strategic planning. A few more kind of points here. Strategic planning is strategic because it involves choosing how to respond to a changing environment. Like we said, it's the North Star for your organization. Strategic planning is systematic because it's a process that is structured and data driven. And strategic planning also is not a few other things. So it's really important here to also clarify what strategic planning isn't good for. So you have that knowledge as well. So generally, strategic planning isn't good for maybe reading tea leaves and trying to make predictions about the future. It's not like a prediction algorithm necessarily. And as pursuant to that, strat plans aren't substitutes for good judgment from your leadership at the organization. So obviously, we're all kind of nonprofits navigating changing environments, especially over the past few years. And it's not a substitute for executive level decision making. You don't want to figure out how you're going to respond to something big that just happened by looking to the strategic plan necessarily to make that decision on your behalf. You want to kind of work alongside the plan you've already created with your decision-making team to answer kind of those big questions, especially when things get chaotic. And finally, strategic planning is not necessarily a linear process. So generally, there is kind of a step-by-step phases for strategic planning that I'll show you in just a minute here. But it doesn't necessarily have to be something that kind of follows a perfectly straight line in most cases. You can double back. And also, really, really important, strategic plans should ultimately be living things. You don't want to do a lot of work and then kind of put it on a shelf where it collects dust and just to kind of have. So strategic plans They're not written in stone. They can be updated if necessary, especially if something big happens at the organization. So in general, a good strategic plan is going to answer these key questions. And the first key questions is, where are we? The second big key question is, where do we want to be? The next key question after that generally is, what is in our way? And then the next and final question is, what do we need to do to get where we want to be? So a good strategic plan is going to help you figure out kind of the answer to all of those questions. And it's going to provide a basis for everyone at the organization to refer back to when they have those questions themselves. And before we kind of launch into the process of the strategic plan, I want you all to think over the question of which of those questions I just posed to you is the toughest at your organization right now to answer. That's also just a good thing to think about because we are going to have a Q&A at the end of our presentation here. So if you're thinking that over, you might want to bring that to discuss with us in the Q&A. So which one of those questions resonates with you most, or which one of those questions are you having the most trouble with right now? So now I do want to give you kind of a broad overview of the basic phases of a strategic planning process. So this is generally what a strategic planning process looks like. Like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be linear. Some of these can be, you can go back on and work on one phase and then move back to another phase. So just keep that in mind. I don't want to be too rigid, but in general, a planning process will follow this kind of structure. And if you're like me and you do need to see some kind of order, this can be very helpful. So for the first phase, you're going to prepare. This is the preparation phase. This is where you want to get buy-in, obviously, from other people at your organization, especially leadership and the board. This is where you're going to identify the challenges and choices that your organization is up against. So thinking back to those questions that we just asked, you're also going to want to think about who's involved with the strategic planning process, who's going to need to be in the room. Again, organizations range in size, to only a few people to dozens of people or even more. So for some of you, answering this question might be really easy. We have a 3-person staff. It's going to be pretty much all of us and the board. But for other organizations that maybe have larger staffs, you have to do some thinking about who's actually going to be involved in the process. And as a part of the preparation phase, you'll agree on kind of what information is needed to move forward into the next phase. So phase 2 of the process, and this can be quite a big part of the entire strategic planning process, is to gather and assess data. Basically, strategic plans really kind of are top heavy here at the beginning with a data gathering part of the strategic planning process. You're going to be aggregating a lot of information because you're going to want to be armed with that information, that you have it in front of you when you actually get into the room with your leadership team and representatives from your board and actually start making the decisions about what to do for the next 3 to 5 years. So you're going to gather information from internal and external stakeholders. This is where you maybe bring someone in to conduct like a SWOT analysis, a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis. This is where any kind of relevant databases, if you have CRM or a management system or something like that, you're going to want to be aggregating data about who your stakeholders are, who the community members are that you serve, all those kinds of things. You're going to spend a lot of time gathering data that is going to help you make decisions. And then going to phase 3. Phase 3 can seem a little redundant because you can say, well, everyone already kind of agrees on our mission, vision, and core values. That's why they're here. But it's always really important to just reaffirm this kind of before you jump into actually having like the big discussions that are involved in creating a strategic plan. So just to think back on why this is important is because, your mission is your kind of who, what, and why of your nonprofit. The vision, it's very close to the mission, but it's ultimately going to describe what success actually looks like. So if you want to make an impact on society, what does that actually look like? And then just to kind of re-up this, your core values are the basic beliefs about why your organization exists and how your organization operates. So I know I said kind of at the beginning that this process isn't exactly linear. And in a lot of cases, phase 2 and phase 3 can sometimes be flipped. You might want to decide to make sure you agree on your mission, vision, and core values before you start gathering data. Or you might want to go ahead and just do the work of gathering and assessing all your data before you move on to that assessment of your mission, vision, and core values. Excuse me. So then you're going to move on to phase 4, which is to, broadly speaking, agree on the really high level goals. This is when you're going to actually kind of get in the room with all this data and all this good information that your organization has, or whatever you have to bring to the table, and actually hash out with your leadership team to make sure everyone's on the same page about what your goals are going to be, and in particular, what your objectives and activities to meet those goals are actually going to be. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. This is like the really big discussion heavy part of the strategic planning process. In general, phase 2 and phase 4 are probably the parts of the process that are going to take up the most amount of time. So you're going to want to invest a lot of time aggregating data and making sure you have enough of that, so that when you reach phase 4 of having these conversations, you can get in the room and actually start agreeing on what your goals, objectives, and activities are going to be. So this can take a lot of time. So again, phase 2 and phase 4 probably going to be kind of the bulk of your strategic planning process. And then phase 5, this is when you're actually going to draft the plan. It's really important to call out here that there is no one size fits all strategic plan model. So you can go out there and find a lot of strategic plans, and they're all going to look kind of different. So that's really important to take note of. But unlike phases 4 and 2, phase 5 is oftentimes maybe one of the quickest. It's kind of when you're actually getting everything down on paper or in your PowerPoint or your Excel document and organizing what all your thoughts are going to be. Obviously, you're going to want to make sure you take a lot of notes during that phase 4 period, so you can capture everything everyone's talking about, and move on to the drafting of the strategic plan itself. So, and then finally, phase 6, you're going to roll out the plan itself. So you want to roll out your strategic plan, not only to the people within your organization, but also to your stakeholders. So internal and external stakeholders. Your board of directors will need the opportunity, obviously, to review and approve the plan. And staff members should also be included in this final review process so that they feel empowered by the vision that they're going to be working towards. Once your plan is finalized, you can consider sharing your goals with external stakeholders after that. And strategic targets can be great motivating factors for donors or volunteers in your community. So you can say, hey, look at this big, beautiful vision that we're creating together over the next coming years. Yeah, and again, strategic plans are oftentimes things that partners and donors ask for. You oftentimes see it asked for on grant applications. So that's just another part of the rollout phase. So again, in terms of questions that you can kind of ponder while you're thinking about strategic planning, think about which one of these phases you feel most confident about your organization being able to carry out. And maybe which phase you don't feel as confident in carrying out, or the phase in which you might think you need some external resources to carry out. Because we're going to give you some tips about maybe how to source for those external resources to help you along at basically each phase in this process. So maybe going back to that stage 5 and stage 4, what does an actual strategic plan look like? So again, strategic plans come in all shapes and sizes. You can just do a quick Google search and you'll see what I'm talking about. But in general, this is the format that you'll see adopted kind of across the board in most cases. And this is really a great format because it allows all members of your organization, from the executive director or CEO down to the volunteer on site stuffing envelopes, to trace all the work they're doing right back to the mission and vision of the organization. This is really great in keeping people motivated, even when things get really busy or when you get lost in emails or spreadsheets or grant applications. And you can remind yourself what the activity you're doing is actually doing to kind of move the needle on your mission. So this structure is really great because it allows everyone at the organization, you should be able to trace back kind of up the chain of how's this activity I'm doing meeting an objective that we want to hit in our strategic plan. Okay, how's that objective serving one of our goals? And obviously, how's that goal serving our mission? A really good strategic plan basically will mean that everyone who's working at the organization can link whatever it is they're doing right back up to the mission. So this is why we kind of show it in this structure here. So I want to give you kind of an example of what this looks like and maybe define some of the terms here, especially like what's the difference between an objective, an activity, and a goal. So as an example of the process here that I'm laying out, let's say your organization runs a shelter for unhoused people. And in the next year, you decide, as kind of a part of your strategic planning process, that you want to increase capacity by 50 people and invest in the supplies needed to do so. That's an example of a goal. So to do this, you find out you need to raise about $25,000 in revenue via new outreach and cultivating existing supporters to increase retention of those people who are already supporting your organization. That's an example of an objective. So an activity that you need to complete, or an activity that's very closely related to the goal itself. And that's kind of like a high level activity that you're all going to kind of be doing smaller activities to work towards. So as a part of that, you decide to have your marketing team launch a crowdfunding campaign on social media. That's an example of what we're talking about at this kind of activity level right at the bottom, the kind of actual kind of day-to-day work. And you're also going to have them make personal calls to large donors to let them know how much value they're providing to increase their retention and maybe get them to donate a little bit more or tap into their own networks to get more donors. That's an example of another activity that's ultimately going to support the objective. So that's just by way of example, like kind of the process. Again, you can see in that example I laid out that those activities can be traced back to the objective of raising that new revenue, which can be traced ultimately back to the goal of increasing the capacity of the shelter, which ultimately is going to, move the needle of your mission, which is helping to end homelessness in Seattle or wherever. That's just kind of by way of an example. Really important to note here too, that your strategic plan does not need to have only 2 goals. This chart just signifies that your plan can have multiple goals, and those goals can have multiple objectives attached to them. And each objective can have multiple activities that goes towards achieving that kind of ultimate objective. So this is just an example. Most strategic plans will have more than 2 goals. But we wanted to kind of just lay this out in a very general way for you so you could kind of understand what we're talking about here. But again, you can have definitely more than 2 goals, and most strategic plans will have more than 2 goals. Again, there is no one-size-fits-all strategic plan. You can go online and find some organizations put their strategic plan up online on their websites. You can see, oh, wow, this organization has a 25-page strategic plan that's full of charts and all sorts of goodies. And you might think, well, we have to have a 25-page strategic plan. That's not necessarily the case. Your strategic plan needs to make sense for your organization. So whether that's 25 pages or just 5 pages, and then you're going to be able to kind of see like what makes the most amount of sense for your organization. It might live in a PowerPoint presentation. It might live in an Excel spreadsheet. It's just going to be what makes the most amount of sense at your organization. Okay, so now that I've kind of covered the basics of strategic planning, I'm going to pass things back off to Kim to talk about how you can access support from volunteers to ultimately support your strategic planning process.
Great, thanks, Josh. And thanks to everybody who's been really engaged, asking great questions in the chat. I think we're gonna have a really good Q&A section later where we'll be able to dig deeper into some of the great questions that are coming up. So definitely keep those coming. And I loved, Josh, that you spent time really just reiterating, doubling down on the value of a strategic plan and going through this process. Because I know that there were some folks who reached out before this event, saying the past 2 years have been so tumultuous and have really upended nonprofits. So that question of the value has definitely been raised, and I think that's fair. What's the point of planning in really turbulent, tumultuous times? I'm going to really date myself with this reference, but I just want to underline the point that Josh made around a strategic plan is not a step-by-step printout of like MapQuest directions, but instead it's guideposts to keep your activities and programs and internal capacity building projects focused as an organization, keeping all of those activities focused on your North Star mission. But flexible enough to adapt to those specific programs, adapt those activities, adapt those internal capacity build-outs in times of flux. So with that in mind, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, we have so much to do. We see the value here. We see the value in certain elements, but how do we pull in the support? How can we actually make this possible? And so I want to briefly touch on how you can access Taproot programs to start requesting some of the support. And then we'll get into the real meat of the examples of the volunteer projects that you can start working on. Okay. So in case we have anyone on the line here who's newer to Taproot, our programs really flow through an online site, taprootplus.org. And we try and keep things as simple and streamlined as possible. So this is a free online nonprofit and volunteer matching platform. We designed this to be really flexible and nimble so that your nonprofit, no matter where you're located, as long as you're in the US, the UK, India, Canada, or the European Union, you're able to sign up for free, as many staff members as you'd like. Board members are also welcome, and start requesting volunteer support. So it's our way of really scaling up who can access resources and from the safety of your own home. So currently, we have over 100,000 total volunteers who are ready to jump in, and we're open to any registered nonprofits, public schools, other public institutions, as well as fiscally sponsored social good organizations, as long as you're registered in those regions I just mentioned, the US, the UK, the EU, Canada, and India. And then I do just want to make a quick note. We do have certain services that are available for small businesses as well. We don't have time to cover that during today's presentation, but our team is happy to reach out to you privately if you do have questions on the small business front. All right, so super quickly, if you don't have an account on Taproot Plus yet, I highly recommend that you create an account right now, so that way you're ready to start taking advantage of resources through the site. So I believe there should be a banner at the top of your screen right now. So click on that and you'll be able to create an account if you're in one of our eligible regions. And then once you have an account, it's time to submit a request. So we offer 2 core forms of service through the platform. One is a short to long-term project where you work really intensely with a volunteer to accomplish a singular goal together. And we can talk more about project examples in just a moment. The other option is a session. This is a quick 1-hour call. It's a consultation with an expert in a certain field. So this is really great for planning, brainstorming, quick answers, quick advice, etc. Okay. I see a lot of questions coming into the chat right now around regional eligibility. So I'll just reiterate that really quickly. So Taproot Plus is currently accessible to any nonprofit, fiscally sponsored social good organization, or public institution. So local governmental groups, public libraries, public schools, etc., as long as you're registered in the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Canada, or India. If you're not in those regions, hopefully there's resources on this call that have been really helpful. I'm about to get into examples of how you can work with volunteers through Taproot or through other means as well that will hopefully be really useful content for you as well. Great. Okay, so as soon as you post a request on Taproot Plus, it kind of looks like this one. We put it out to our volunteer communities and help you recruit a really great partner. All right, so with all of that said, and I know folks are already chiming in that they're going to the site, which is great. I want to get into the good stuff. I want to get into the actual examples of how volunteers can support your strategic planning process. So I'm going to go phase by phase through the buckets of work that Josh spoke about earlier. So let's start with phase one, prepare. So in this bucket of work, you're really just starting out. You're wondering, okay, where do I even begin? What information do I need to have gathered? What materials do I need to have prepared? And this is really where you're going to be starting to think about, how am I going to be defining these specific and measurable and achievable and relevant and time-bound goals as part of this process? And so that's why project management is listed first on this page, because project management can be a great volunteer skill set to pull in when you're first starting out with your strategic planning journey. You can consider requesting a session or having a quick consultation call with a volunteer, just asking the question, how do I begin to organize this huge undertaking, right? You could also request a project, a short-term project with someone who is an expert project manager who could make tool recommendations for software that you could leverage as part of this process, training to get your staff members or board members up to speed on how to embed that project management best practices or tools in their own work. You could also bring a project manager in to help you develop a project plan for carrying out the strategic planning process, help you build that roadmap that you'll then use to take your team, your strategic planning team, through phase one all the way to phase 6. Someone can actually help you develop that project plan. The next idea here is around stakeholder interviews. And this is something that Josh mentioned earlier. You really want to make sure that you're pulling in feedback and ideas and advice and recommendations from folks in your internal sphere. So your staff members, your board members, your volunteers. You also want to be opening up those interviews and that feedback gathering to folks outside of your organization. So the program participants, some of your donors or your funders that you've worked with, your corporate partners, they could all be really, really interesting sources of information that you could then use to later shape your plan as you get into phase 4 and 5. So with stakeholder research, this is really all around getting to know your target audiences and getting to know the best ways where you can reach them. The next item here, leadership coaching. Strategic planning is a massive undertaking. And if you have been tasked at your organization to lead this, teaming up with an HR professional, someone who coaches others, coaches executives for a living, could be a really great way to build your own personal capacity to lead this process forward. You could also extend that coaching and bring in support for other staff leaders or board members who might be engaging in this process as well, to really level up their skill set for managing effectively in times of change, times of transition. So you'll see a few examples here of how you can use a session, which again, it's a 1-hour consultation call, as well as some longer term projects. Under the HR assessment bucket, it's really important here. One of the main ways you can build resiliency as an organization is by assessing where you stand internally and then brainstorming ways to improve upon weaknesses, leaning into organizational strengths, etc. And so a huge part of that is going to be digging into and investigating which HR policies should be implemented. Are you competitive when it comes to staff recruitment? Researching new remote work standards, or conducting an internal engagement survey can all be really helpful pieces to begin the preparation for a large-scale strategic planning process. And then kind of the same theory is under this financial analysis bucket around, making sure your house is in order in terms of your budgetary and financial management practices. And so by bringing a volunteer in now during phase 1, you'll have some of that data rolling in. You'll be building that documentation to set you up for success later in the strategic planning journey. Okay. So again, thank you so much for the great questions and comments coming in. Definitely keep those coming. I want to move us into the phase 2 bucket because there's a lot here. And I know many of you mentioned in the chat that phase 2 is where you had some concerns about, I don't know if I have enough resources internally to carry out all of this data gathering. And so I do want to highlight this bucket in particular is so ripe for opportunity to bring in volunteer support. There is great experience that exists here in the corporate space that you can lean on and really use to build your plan. Okay, so I'll start from the top. SWOT analysis. So SWOT analysis stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's really a core building block for effective strategic planning. And so work with a skilled volunteer to research things like industry trends and use feedback from your stakeholders that you already completed in phase 1 with your stakeholder interviews, can create a breakdown of your nonprofit's internal strengths and weaknesses and external opportunities and threats. And so with longer term sustainability and resiliency in mind, you could also ask your volunteer to examine how natural disasters, public health crises, political upheaval, etc., could impact your programs in the future, and fundraising ability or reliance on in-person volunteers could be added to that list as well. So you've got some good ideas here for how to use a quick session or some longer term projects with volunteers, including conducting an environmental scan, as well as actually conducting the SWOT analysis. Next on the list is something called a competitor and collaborator analysis. And so this is an opportunity to partner with a skilled volunteer to research who else in your field or region is offering competing or complementary services. And I mention this in particular because in times of uncertainty or large-scale community need, your organization can lean on this analysis to think through how you could work together to serve community members, to share resources, or to even merge programs. And in times of security or stability, knowing who your peers are provides really important benchmarking information for program impact, your marketing efforts, and more. So this is a really important piece to lean into. And so a few ideas listed here around benchmarking and then completing the analysis. And then I want to jump ahead to pricing strategy. It's the last item here on the list, and there's some other really great things above it, such as impact measurement, gathering that data, doing the analysis, persona development, which is kind of a continuation of that stakeholder interview section, really getting to know who your audience members are and how to reach them, what they're motivated by, what they're inspired by, what they need more of. But pricing strategy is another really key example. And so that's why I want to highlight it. Are your organization's programs or services being priced appropriately to cover costs? And are those costs being properly allocated? So much of the strategic planning process has to do with the allocation of resources, both financial, staff resources, volunteer resources, et cetera. And so this is going to be a really key building block to use throughout the strategic planning process and when you're implementing the strategic plan down the road, right? So digging into these pricing questions can help you build additional financial security and really pay off in times of transition or times of uncertainty. And so we really recommend engaging a volunteer with experience in budgeting or financial management to get to the root of your budgetary needs during this phase. All right. So with that said, I want to jump ahead to stage 3, phase 3, switching between, because we have some other really great ways that nonprofits can get support from skilled volunteers here as well. So the first one I want to start with is discussion facilitation. So you can actually get support from volunteers to assist you in conducting these brainstorming, these blue sky, these strategy conversations that your team and board members are engaged in. You can actually have a volunteer who's really skilled in this area come in and help you either build the facilitation plan or to actually execute the facilitation for you. So both are on the table. And as part of this work, I do want to highlight, consider bringing in program participants to speak to your group when you're engaged in these blue sky brainstorming moments. As you're talking about aligning around your mission and your vision and your core values, as Josh was mentioning earlier, it's going to be really important that you create grounding moments for your strategic planning team and just allow them opportunities to reaffirm why you're all doing this work that you do so well. So consider how you can bring your community members into this process, and program participants speaking about how a program has impacted them could be a really great opportunity to do just that. Another project or another way you could bring volunteers in to support this strategic plan would be if you're actually in the stage of an organization where you don't have defined core values yet. That's totally okay. I know Taproot, our community is full of amazing startup organizations. And so that's incredible. So we have ways to support you as well. So if you haven't defined what's really near and dear to your organization and how that could translate into organizational values, have a session with a volunteer from HR and from an HR strategy world who's really skilled in bringing those types of values to life. You could also team up with a volunteer for a project that delivers, that the end deliverable is a set of organizational values. So you can actually work through that full exercise with someone as well. And then, of course, key messaging work. So key messages is kind of like an elevator statement of who your organization is, who you're serving, and how you talk about yourself, how you pitch yourself, and your programs, and why you exist as an organization. And so as you're thinking about aligning around mission, vision, and values, think about how you say those things. How do you communicate those things externally? And so key messaging could be a really interesting project to engage a volunteer in during this stage as well. All right. Getting into the all-important phase 4. You'll notice there's nothing on this slide, so you might be thinking that Taproot messed up here. But it's actually because our volunteers cannot make strategic decisions for you. They are here to support you in getting all of the information, all of the inspiration, all of the data, all of the facilitation support your team needs to bring that big, audacious, beautiful vision together. But our volunteers and Taproot, we can't tell you what that roadmap should be. That has to be something, that has to be a decision that your organization ultimately comes to. So a volunteer can certainly support you during this phase with facilitating meetings or working time sessions when you and your team are working on agreeing on your strategic goals. However, agreeing on the goals and setting that map, that has to be a decision made by you and your team. So moving ahead to phase 5, actually drafting this thing. So obviously copywriting support, definitely an area where you can pull in volunteers to assist. So that's one of the quicker projects we see matched actually through Taproot. So really, really recommend copywriting or copy editing. Graphic design is also another really good one to consider, especially Josh mentioned strategic plans take many different formats, right? So it could be an Excel file, it can be a Word doc, it could be a deck, it could be a video. I've seen them take all sorts of looks and shapes and feels. And so if the strategic plan that you're creating, you want it to have more of a visual component, consider bringing in a graphic designer to help you build that. And then again, I put project management again in this phase because it's so important to have clear and consistent project management throughout this entire process. And especially in this phase, because you're literally creating the thing right now. And so you need to make sure you're sticking to your timeline, you're executing where you need to, all of the work, all of the pieces are coming together. And so consider bringing in volunteer project management support here as well to continue fueling that. And then really quickly in our last phase, how are you sharing it out with folks? You could build a communications plan with a great volunteer. You could work together with someone to create public relations strategies. And again, copywriting. What kind of messaging and marketing channels would resonate best for this type of announcement? How are you going to communicate this great news out to your internal audiences as well as your external audiences? So lots of really great ideas here as well. But with that, I do want to skip ahead to questions because we've gotten really, really great, smart questions throughout the event in the chat, and I want to leave us plenty of time to dive into those. So Josh, I'm going to pass the mic over to you.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, we got some really, really good questions coming in that we want to go ahead and dive into to make sure that we're able to kind of get to most of these on air. If for whatever reason we aren't able to tackle your question, we will try and follow up with you. So some really good questions, I think, about the kind of portion of mapping out what a strategic plan actually looks like with regard to mission, goals, objectives, and activities. So we got a few questions kind of asking for more clarification about that. So a really good question of are the activities the same as the programs? The activities that you're doing, at least in that structure, could be part of a program, but it isn't necessarily restricted to like just your programming. So if you think back to that example I gave, for example, about in order to hit that number of, $25,000 extra in revenue to expand, the facility at that shelter, they wanted to do a crowdfunding campaign. That's not necessarily a program that you're maybe offering to, your community or stakeholders necessarily. But it's just an activity that you're doing to kind of reach that higher objective and that kind of higher goal of expanding, the services to 50 more people. Activities can be part of programs, but the activities of that like kind of breakdown are kind of more whatever adheres to like the objective and the goal. So it's not necessarily always programming. So in order to like also kind of, there was another question that came in kind of about like objectives versus kind of activities versus goals. So to like make that distinction a little bit more, objectives are kind of the difference between an objective and a goal is essentially kind of in like the size or how expansive that it is. So a goal is kind of very, very broad and something that you're looking to achieve over like a longer period of time. So maybe a whole year or maybe several years. Whereas an objective is kind of a smaller, more short-term, tangible thing that you're doing to help achieve that goal. So in thinking back to that example, the kind of overall goal is the expansion of that facility. And the objective is kind of the technical milestone of, well, we need to kind of hit this level of revenue to kind of achieve that larger goal. So goals and objectives are very closely related to each other. And sometimes it can be a little hard to distinguish. That's actually what you're going to distinguish when you actually get into that room and start actually having that conversation based off of all the data, is making that distinction between what the goals and the objectives are. Really, the distinction is kind of in size and breadth. And the objectives are kind of going to be the smaller level goals under the goals, but it's just easier for the purposes of demonstration to call them objectives rather than like goals 2.0. So objectives and goals are very closely related to each other. Activities, as you saw kind of in that example of doing the actual crowdfunding or the marketing campaign via phone, that's kind of the actual work that like people at the organization are going to be doing to help achieve that objective. So kind of the more technical day-to-day thing, you'll see kind of in that pyramid, there is kind of a expansion from very broad over a longer period of time to kind of much more specific and like day-to-day. So your mission is, the thing you're working towards over many years. Goals are things you're going to be working towards maybe for a year or a few years. And then kind of it goes down more granularly to that level of kind of, okay, this is the activity we're doing like this month that we're working towards kind of on a day-to-day basis. So you move from very general to specific when you go through that kind of that breakdown of mission, goals, objectives, activities. You're moving from very, very general to very specific. A question about kind of what types of data to gather. Kim touched on this a little bit when she was talking about the different phases. The data that you're going to gather is, and I think we have it back up on the slide here. So this is an example of the kind of data projects that a lot of organizations pursue when they're looking at strategic planning. But for what this means is for you as nonprofits in particular, knowing kind of the base of the community that you're supporting. So like who they are, who you're trying to target, collecting data about potential funders, who they are, who you're trying to target with potential funders. Those are examples of the types of data that you're going to be gathering as well. So the people that you're serving, the people that you're pitching, you're maybe going to want to collect data about potential, sources of fundraising, things like that. And so the data that you're gathering can kind of be anything and everything that you think is going to affect the decisions that you have to make during this strategic planning process. So it could be everything from interviews with, that are conducted by an HR evaluator at everyone at your organization. Or it can be, the spreadsheet you have of every kid who's ever participated in your kind of after school program and, what age they are, where they come from, what neighborhood they live in, whether they have one parent or two, it can be like down to that as well. I'm also going to let Kim came off the mic, so I'm going to let her jump in here as well.
No, I loved that response, and thank you so much for touching more on kind of breakdown between activities, objectives, goals. I think that was really helpful. I'm going to rapid fire responses to some of the more recent questions that have been coming through the chat, Josh, to allow you time to revisit our list from questions earlier on in the presentation. So first, where does developing a vision fit? In that mission, vision, and values section. So if your organization is still at an early stage and hasn't quite solidified a vision yet, that could be an activity that you work on it here. Business planning support and advice, absolutely something that you can tap into Taproot volunteer support for. That's a great either session if you just want quick recommendations, advice, or a longer term project. A volunteer can actually help you create a business plan, connecting your organization's goals into how you're actually bringing in that revenue, the funding that's going to help you achieve those goals. And then we had some really good questions around how do concept narratives or theories of change fit into this process. I want to acknowledge that I think we have a lot of younger organizations on the line today, and so many of you might not have established theories of change yet. That's totally fine. Actually, developing a theory of change is quite an intensive process and could be a goal within your strategic plan for the next 2 years, right? Doing the research, doing the data gathering to craft this statement that addresses how you're ending the societal problem, and like what your vision is and how this is all coming together for the future. So that's something that could actually be a goal that you and your team work to achieve as part of this year's or next year's strategic plan. And then another quick one that I'll answer is 1 to 2 year strategic plans. Absolutely on the table. Taproot has used 1 to 2 year strategic plans at moments in our history as well. There's no one size fits all solution to strategic plans. So I know we referenced 3 to 5 years earlier. We've also seen lots of great examples of 1 to 2 year plans as well. And then I saw a question around how to access Taproot volunteers. So I will quickly refer you to Taproot Plus, which is our free online platform for, it's kind of a matchmaking platform, match.com, for nonprofits and skilled professionals looking to share their professional strengths with organizations like yours. So with that, I'm going to pass things back to you. I think I got to pretty good rapid fire there.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. But yeah, I want to take it back and jump into some of the questions about the content as well. So in looking over here, there are some questions here too about looks like it came from some nonprofits who have signed up on Taproot Plus, maybe have posted projects or sessions to the marketplace, but haven't gotten any hits on those yet. Definitely reach out to us because as the nonprofit success coach, like I have conversations with nonprofits all the time about best practices for posting projects and sessions to our marketplace. And I'd love to be able to just like carve out some time to talk with you one-on-one. A good thing to also call out about sessions is you have to keep in mind that these are generally tailored to be 1 hour consultative sessions. So you want your ask to generally be pretty specific and focused around a core challenge or question that can be tackled in 1 hour, and that needs to be focused around a specific skill set. So again, please reach out to us so like we can schedule maybe a larger conversation and I can lead you kind of through the process of tailoring and crafting a really good need statement for posting projects and for posting advertisements for consultative sessions as well. So there's also organizations here that have asked questions about, it looks like they're just starting out. They don't necessarily have a lot of stakeholders or board members or members or funders or volunteers. I think going back to what Kim was talking about for smaller organizations and making sure, first of all, that your mission, vision, and kind of core values are established. And I still think those aspects of the strategic planning process can be really helpful if you're an organization that's really just starting out. Even having those things established and the rationale for having those things established can help you make pitches for more funding and for bringing on other future members of the organization, especially if you're looking for funding opportunities and they're asking for strategic plans and things like that. There are still pieces of the strategic planning process, if you have a really, really small team and you're just starting out, that you might be able to tackle. Even if, like we said, a lot of people on their strategic plans have like a lot of different goals. You don't necessarily have to have, 10 different goals. It could just be 1 or 2. I think what potential stakeholders and donors and supporters are really looking for is that you've actually taken time to think about those things critically, even if you just have 1 or 2 broad goals, but showing to people that, hey, we've mapped out what our goal is, what our objective is, and what the actual activities we need to do to get there is. Now we need you to come in and actually support us so we can hire the people to do this, or maybe we need board members to help, facilitate this conversation. Even if you can just take that process and just show that you've thought through all those things critically, maybe for 1 or 2 goals, I think that is all the more helpful in, making a pitch for new resources if you're a brand new nonprofit that's really scrappy and kind of in startup mode. So another great question here from nonprofit, that they actually completed stakeholder interviews in 2019, but obviously everything that happened during the height of the pandemic really changed the game for them. And so their strategic planning project was on hold. And they're kind of wondering, where do they go from here if they need to restart? I think, things have been thrown for such a loop, especially for nonprofits, that it might be necessary to go back and kind of reconvene with those stakeholders and possibly redo those stakeholder interviews, just because people coming in, on one side of the pandemic versus coming out of the other side, things are probably going to have changed. So again, it's like one of those situations where there's like a lot of chaos, but you want to make sure that you have accurate data going into those strategic planning conversations. So investing that time in there to go back and do some of those stakeholder interviews again, I think would actually be well worthwhile. But also, I think, you can still use those stakeholder interviews from 2019. And if you actually think back to some of those projects we talked about, you could maybe team up with a volunteer who could help you distinguish what's still really useful in those stakeholder interviews you did. There's still probably some very relevant information in there that hasn't changed. And you don't want to lose that. But I think it, might be necessary to go back and reconduct some of those stakeholder interviews to make sure that you have the most accurate data possible. So looking through some more of these questions, how do we recruit volunteers at the Taproot Foundation? We recruit from kind of various diverse pools. We have partnership with LinkedIn that allows us to recruit from their volunteer marketplace or cross-post projects from their volunteer marketplace. We have a lot of partners in the corporate world and from other foundations whose employees they engage and bring to the table for our pool of volunteers as well. So we also make pitches to potential volunteers kind of through various social media channels and professional associations and things like that. So we recruit from a really kind of diverse pool of skilled volunteers in the business community. Someone's asking, I guess, to clarify kind of what stakeholders actually are. Are they your clients or those who have invested? And the answer is both in that case. Stakeholders is a really broad term, but it's, your beneficiaries of your programming, but, also your donors are stakeholders, but your employees and board members are also stakeholders. So usually people differentiate between external and internal stakeholders. So people on the outside of the organization that are dependent on the organization or have invested in the organization in some way. And then people obviously on the inside of the organization, like your employees and your leadership and things like that, are internal stakeholders. So you as a member of your organization are a stakeholder as well. But that's a really great question to kind of clarify some of that jargon.
Yeah, I'm glad that you jumped on that one, Josh. I do just want to note, I know we're a couple minutes over. Thank you so much for everybody who's hung around. Josh and I think, can stay for a few more minutes to continue answering questions. But please, if you do need to jump, we totally understand. And we will follow up with you through email later today. And so if you have any outstanding questions, you'll have our contact information, and please get in touch with us. But for now, we'll hang on the line for another couple minutes to continue answering some. Okay, yeah. Sorry, Josh, I'm gonna run through some of the quicker questions really fast. So one is around what if we don't have enough stakeholders or funders or volunteers just getting started? And I know, Josh, you touched on this earlier when you're sharing tips for younger organizations, and I want to underline some of the points you made and say this could be a goal in your strategic plan. to recruit board members, to build a fuller board that's representative of the community that your nonprofit is serving. A goal in your strategic plan can be to recruit a fully staffed organization and build a strong and thriving culture within your organization. So the things that you're pointing out that you don't yet have, that could be a piece of the plan that you're looking to build. So I just wanted to underline that. And then really quickly, there was a question around, does Taproot still do in-person engagements anymore? So the answer is yes, but kind of. So we have not hosted in-person volunteer nonprofit events or programs over the past 2 years because of the public health crises across the world. However, the intention is to resume those once it is safe again. So in the meantime, we've been hosting in-person events on a virtual basis. So we do local gatherings of nonprofits and volunteers when funding allows us to. So once you create your Taproot Plus account, you will be notified by the email that you use to sign up for Taproot Plus if opportunities for these one-off events, gatherings, happen to come up and your organization is eligible to get involved. So yes, kind of, we still do those, but in a slightly different way. Okay, back to you, Josh.
Yeah, I was going to say, Kim, speaking to that really great question of like, look, we're a really small nonprofit just starting out. You know, maybe you're so small that your entire staff right now is like 2 people. You're like, it's me and another person that are volunteering our time. One of your goals as part of your strategic plan could literally just be, we want to make at least 1 full-time hire in the next year. That could literally just be one of your goals. So anyone can think strategically and go into a strategic planning process, no matter how small you are. Your goals could just be really basic, and that's perfectly fine. I think, you know, with a strategic plan, it's all about demonstrating that you've thought really critically about, you know, we want to make 1 full-time hire, and this is how we're going to get there. That's really, really good for showing, you know, external stakeholders or, you know, the people that are potential donors, potential supporters, that you've thought critically about this. So one of your goals.
I love that. And it gets back into the SMART goal setting that I know we've touched on elements of those specific and measurable and achievable, realistic, time-bound goals throughout this. But be realistic with yourself and the capacity that your organization, your team is going to have to carry this forward. And so if you are a volunteer-run organization, maybe adding 1 full-time paid staff member is the perfect SMART goal to set. And then I really quickly want to address 2 quick questions that came in around giving circles. If a giving circle is something that you'd like to create, I think stakeholder interviews would actually be a great step to see if your organization has enough interest from community members in sustaining a giving circle. So I actually think you need to ask that in any focus group or stakeholder research that you conduct during phase 1, phase 2 of the strategic planning process. Same things if you're considering like an associate or a junior board. Again, those interviews can tell you or give you the right data you need to know if those things would be viable. And if they are, then they could be elements of your strategic plan. Maybe it's an activity or an objective within your strategic plan to create and maintain a giving circle or to create and maintain an associate or junior board. And then another really quick one, do we talk about any of the new features that we offer? One thing I do just want to shout out is that we have rolled out a new and improved version of Taproot Plus Sessions, which is those 1-hour one-on-one consultation calls with volunteers. And we talk through a lot of really great examples of what you can use those sessions for today. And so if you are a Taproot Plus user already, try out sessions again. Let us know what you think of the new changes, the new experience. We're excited to hear your feedback, but we think the process will be a lot easier to use and you'll be able to get a lot more value from it. So thanks so much for that question, Adrienne. Back to you, Josh.
Yeah, there was another good question in here that kind of syncs up with what we're talking about a bit earlier about, you know, your goals can be as simple as we want one full-time hire, or maybe even we want one part-time hire. If you're an all volunteer-led organization, there's a question here where the person is talking about their organization's been around for many years and had a lot of successes, but hasn't had much in the way of organization structure, financial management, or been able to find detailed financial info other than tax returns. Again, your goals could be as simple as simply clarifying one of those things. So in terms of the financial management, maybe your goal could be, we want to set up a QuickBooks account and make sure we have a clear chart of accounts that we can always reference to make high-level financial decisions, and make sure that we have ready to go for grant applications and things like that. I want to also just call back to something I said during the presentation, that there is no necessarily one-size-fits-all strategic planning goal or process necessarily. Your goals for your organization are maybe going to look very different from an organization that has 75 full-time people. Their goals are going to look very different from the organization that has maybe 3 full-time people. And that's perfectly fine. What a big goal could be for you is maybe not necessarily a big goal for another organization, and vice versa. But I think again, going back to the importance of the strategic planning process, is that you have a clear pathway to get to whatever your goal is. So don't think about comparing yourself too much to other nonprofits. Make sure that you're clearly linking your day-to-day activities and that you can trace them back to one of those goals. And obviously that your goals are something you can trace back to your mission and vision. So that's really important as well. So that's a great question. An organization that's maybe been around a long time, but is kind of still figuring out like what its structure or management actually is. That could be one of your goals. I think we got a lot of really great questions.
We got a lot of really great questions. I think we may have gone through and hit each one that we saw. We will comb through the chat logs after this event, and if we did not address your question, we will reach out to you personally. So rest assured, your question will get answered. And like I mentioned before, we are sending out this recording as soon as we possibly can. And so you'll have our contact information, and please stay in touch with us. I know Josh mentioned we've just added a really great resource for nonprofits. We're investing in coaching and consultation calls with Taproot staff members so that you can better prepare for and use pro bono with our skilled volunteer community members. So if you think that would be a great resource for you, that's something we encourage you, invite you to stay in touch with us about as well. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up for today. We'll get you that recording shortly. And we encourage you, when we send you that follow-up email, share the information with your team members or your board members, right? Taproot does not place any cap on the number of accounts that your organization can actively be using to bring in volunteer support. So please share it with your team members, get them on board as well to really maximize your use of volunteers. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for being such an engaged group. We really appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.